So good. It is very good to see everyone. Thank you, especially to the Sanctity community for hustling over here this afternoon. It was an obligatory addendum to the prayer today. So it's my great pleasure to introduce this year's visiting Toth-Lonergan Professor, Dr. Jonathan Heaps. So John's brilliance has been on regular display this year during his teaching in the Praxis program. He's also the director of the Bernard Lonergan Institute at the Center for Catholic Studies, as well as an adjunct faculty member in the Department of the Core. Before coming to Seton Hall, he had completed his education in later years at some good Catholic institutions. So he received an MA from Boston College, an STM from Boston University, his Ph.D. At Marquette University, studying with Bob Doran, S.J. there. His scholarly work focuses on Roman Catholic philosophy and fundamental theology, with particular expertise, as we're going to hear, in the work of Bernard Lonergan. His research engages deeply with questions of freedom, embodiment, and culture, and more recently explores the relationship between spirituality and scholarly method. He is the author of the recently published The Ambiguity of Being, Bernard Lonergan and the Problems of the Supernatural, published by Catholic University Press in 2023. He has, as a very gifted communicator, he does not only the systematic kind of work very well, but the communications. He reaches a broader audience through his podcasting, through popular publications. I recommend his recent articles in Commonweal. The most recent was called The Church is Not a Culture. He did one just a few months before that called Things Will Get Better Before They Get Worse. Let's hope. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Heaps.
Thanks so much, Pat. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to jump right into it. So this is the title of my lecture is Finding a Path in the Dark, Lonergan's Guidance for Getting Oriented in a Disorienting World. On February 18th of 1968, the children's television program Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood aired across the United States for the first time. Its creator and host, Fred Rogers, was from Latrobe, Pennsylvania, a wealthy Pittsburgh suburb. He had studied music in college, but on a visit home, he encountered a new disruptive communications technology, a television. On his parents' TV, in a show meant for children, he saw they were throwing pies in people's faces, humiliation presented as entertainment. Mr. Rogers would report for the rest of his life how angry this made him. Though he'd had in mind to become a church pastor, his anger sent him in a new direction. He still went and got a divinity degree at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and was still ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1963, but his ministry would be to children, and his church would be television. I watched the show myself as a child in the late 1980s and early 90s. The final episode aired in 2001, and in 2003, Mr. Rogers died at the age of 74. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood went on the air at a tumultuous time. In the summer of 1967, there had been race riots around the United States, including here in Newark. In October of 67, the communist revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara was captured and killed in Bolivia with the cooperation of the CIA. In January of 1968, a period of liberalizing reform seemed on the verge of taking hold in Czechoslovakia when Alexander Dubček was elected first secretary of the Communist Party there. The movement would be crushed by Soviet invasion the following August. That same January, North Korea seized the American spy ship USS Pueblo, imprisoning and torturing its crew for 11 months. That month also saw the start of the Tet Offensive and what we now call the Vietnam War, but was in fact a conflict initiated by the executive branch and never officially declared by Congress. In February, state and local police fired on demonstrators against racial segregation at South Carolina State University in Orangeburg, killing 3 and injuring 28. On March 16th of 1968, Bobby Kennedy entered the Democratic presidential primary. he'd be assassinated that June. Martin Luther King Jr. had been killed in early April. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood would air a special and controversial episode addressing the murders later that summer. I don't know if you can read it up there, but at the bottom it says, "What does assassination mean?" And it's a question that Daniel Stripe Tiger is asking to Lady Aberlin. The same day that the Kennedy campaign began, Bernard Lonergan gave a lecture in Pittsburgh titled "Belief Today's Issue." In that lecture, Lonergan made a case for a wider conception of believing than his audience, and perhaps mine, might spontaneously admit. Belief, he argued, is not just the province of religious faith, nor is belief opposed to knowledge, nor is belief the department only of common sense. Indeed, he argued, belief is at the very heart of not only common sense, but also of every modern science. He insisted that belief is a necessary condition if humanity's coming to know is to be a group enterprise, if it is to be increased and accelerated by a division of labor. Why then did Lonergan think belief was that day's issue? Because, he wrote, in times of little social or cultural change, beliefs are stable and little open to question. But in times of great social and cultural change, beliefs too are changing. And because they are only beliefs, because they are not personally acquired knowledge, such change leaves believers at a loss. They are disorientated. They do not know which way to turn. They feel that all they have taken for granted is menaced. They may be tempted to unbelief as a liberation, or they may dread skepticism as destructive of truly human living. This afternoon, I want to focus on Lonergan's claim that in times of great social and cultural change, believers are disoriented. And, per my title, to share some of Father Lonergan's guidance for getting oriented in a disorienting world. In the interest of time, I will assume, rather than argue, that ours is a time of great social and cultural change. I could offer examples, but I trust you can conjure those for yourself. I will assume as well, on the back of Father Lonergan's analysis, that you are believers, not in the narrow sense of religious adherence, but in Lonergan's more capacious sense. If you are a scholar, you believe the testimony of those in your field whose work you cite in your own. If you are a student, you believe the bulk of what your teachers and your textbooks offer you to learn. If you are someone's child, you believed reams of judgments offered to you on your way up to speed about this dizzying world in which we live. I could go on, but I won't. By extension, then, I am going to proceed on the suspicion that, like me, at some level you feel disorientated by our time of great social and cultural change. I further suspect that at least in some quiet, dreadful moments, you both desire to find a path in the dark and also fear that anyone offering guidance is just as disoriented as you. That, if we were honest with ourselves, it's the blind leading the blind out here. All of that is to say, in this lecture, I'm going to speak to you person to person, because Father Lonergan's guidance for getting oriented in a disorienting world begins with the person. But even that way of speaking, the person, is too abstract. Getting oriented always begins with a person. And while that's less abstract, it's still too hypothetical. Getting oriented doesn't just begin with someone, it begins with you. It's you who are disoriented. It's you who needs to find a path in the dark. And if that's not you, then this lecture may not be very meaningful for you. You may walk away with no more than what Newman termed notional apprehension of my point, and I'm sorry about that. Still, perhaps you can exercise what I sometimes call empathic imagination. Maybe you can at least imagine what it would be like to be someone disoriented, someone for whom how do I find a path in the dark is a live and even urgent question. One of the hallmarks of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was his way of speaking directly to the viewer, who he called his television neighbor, through the camera, addressing them in the second person, you. He would, for example, look into the camera and tell you, the viewer, that you've made today a special day, just by being you, that there's no one else in the whole world just like you, and that he, Mr. Rogers, likes you just the way you are. He even had a song to underline this point. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing. It's called It's You I Like, and the lyrics are as follows. It's you I like. It's not the things you wear, it's not the way you do your hair, but it's you I like. The way you are right now, the way down deep inside you. Not the things that hide you, not your toys, they're just beside you. But it's you I like. Every part of you, your skin, your eyes, your feelings, whether old or new. I hope that you'll remember, even when you're feeling blue, that it's you I like. It's you yourself. It's you. It's you I like. There's a wonderful video on YouTube, by the way, of him singing this to Joan Rivers on The Tonight Show. And she just about implodes from embarrassment. It's quite amazing. In this way, Mr. Rogers built his show around the affirmation of the person, of a person, a you, rather than, as he'd seen in his first encounter with the television, their humiliation, degradation, or exploitation. At a philosophical level, Lonergan would argue that we can, properly speaking, only become conscious of a person as a person in affirmations like this. It is, to use something of a technical term, a matter of identity. Only you are identical with yourself, and to address you as you is, at minimum, a tacit affirmation of that unique and irreplaceable identity. It is also, as it happens, why Mr. Rogers can so confidently claim that there is no one else in the whole world just like you. I might add as well that there never will be. Only you have the unique and unrepeatable privilege of being you. Precisely because this privilege is unique and unrepeatable, it is also precious. If lost or squandered, it cannot be replaced. But this same preciousness is also why Mr. Rogers can say with confidence that it's you he likes. Being you is not a mere matter of fact, it's also a value. It's worthwhile. For that reason, we can also say that being you is a gift. It is a precious thing you receive and could not earn. We, that is, those of us who are not you, also receive this precious, unique, and unrepeatable privilege and gift. Because you are always you with us. Well, with some of us anyway. And in fact, that adds to the privilege and gift. Those of us with you join an elite who have the privilege, the gift, of experiencing, knowing, interacting with the unique and unrepeatable you. Again, because this privilege is irreplaceable, it is precious as well. Or anyway, it ought to be. And so we can see now how consciousness of any person as a person depends on a double affirmation. To speak to you insofar as you are a person requires that I affirm, at least by my actions, but also in my thoughts and speech, both the fact of your unique and irreplaceable identity with yourself, but also the value, the worthwhileness of your being you. While it is essential, especially morally, to recognize and affirm the personhood of others, it is another matter to make the same affirmation about yourself. Now, there are good reasons to think that the seeds of self-affirmation are sown in the interpersonal context. Commonly, the experience of receiving this affirmation from another person catalyzes self-affirmation. There is literature in psychology going back decades theorizing the process by which a self emerges in the space opened by the intersubjective attunement with and interpersonal recognition from our primary caregivers. Alan Shore at UCLA is really good on this stuff. But precisely because you are identical with yourself, the subsequent self-affirmation, the affirmation of yourself as yourself, occurs in an intrapersonal context. It is an event and an action performed on the stage of your own inner life. No one can do it for you. Under the best circumstances, this self-affirmation can occur wrapped in gratitude, because you have heard and believed the testimony of another that being identical with yourself is a privilege and a precious gift. It is my sincere hope for each of you that if nothing else, you carry this deep truth away from this lecture. It is a good thing that you are and are yourself. I'm going to say that again. It is a good thing that you are and are yourself. However, even under the most benign circumstances, a dilemma follows closely behind self-affirmation's gratitude. For self-affirmation carries with it an implication. I didn't just now start being myself. I've been myself this whole time. Everything you have done up to now has been determining this you that you inescapably are. You have been the agent of every action you've ever taken. You carry habits and tendencies and preferences reinforced by the actions you've repeated. You've made commitments, decisions, mistakes, and promises, all now trailing behind this you that you are. Moreover, the dilemma is heightened because you are always you with us. You have been making the person that the rest of us, your fellow travelers, each living as our own precious and unrepeatable selves, have been living with so far and have to live with from now on. The way you have been you, in other words, has been affecting our experience of being ourselves as well. And so whatever newfound responsibility to yourself emerges with self-affirmation, your responsibility to others emerges at the same time. So what hopefully first showed itself in an atmosphere of gratitude can very quickly become clouded with dread. You may be struck by the suspicion that up to this point you have been what Lonergan called the drifter. The drifter, Lonergan writes, has not, and forgive Lonergan's gendered language here, has not yet found himself. He has not yet discovered his own deed, and so is content to do what everyone else is doing. He has not yet discovered his own will, and so he is content to choose what everyone else is choosing. He has not yet discovered a mind of his own, and so he is content to think and say what everyone else is thinking and saying. And the others, too, are apt to be drifters, each of them doing and choosing and thinking and saying what others happen to be doing, choosing, thinking, saying. I anticipate that Lonergan's description of the drifter, if you see yourself in it, and have been shaped by an individualist culture, might evoke feelings of shame. If so, by all means notice and acknowledge those feelings, but I would also encourage you to pause. If a community is fortunate enough to inherit relatively thoughtful values and beliefs and discourse, even the drifter can choose reasonably worthwhile actions, believe basically true ideas, and speak a mostly apt language. One can drift, in other words, in more or less friendly seas. Indeed, whole cultures and societies and institutions are built to help float young people through their formation on their way to the responsibilities of adulthood. Nobody comes into this world already exercising open-eyed, deliberate autonomy. Alternatively, if you harbor suspicions that the culture, society, or institutions in which you've been drifting are less than benign, you may also find your initial shame transformed into defensiveness. You may find yourself disturbed by the you into whom you have been shaped, and you may object, "It's not my fault. They told me these values were good, these ideas were true, that this language spoke of reality on reality's terms." And in one respect, you're bound to be correct. Largely, it has not been your fault. Indeed, you may have been exercising what Lonergan called the minor authenticity of a person devoting themselves diligently to being whoever their culture invited them to be. And even more than that, it is important not to forget that any shame you might feel does not have to be toxic, radical self-condemnation. That would contradict the very self-affirmation that raised the question in the first place. The only reason such defensiveness could emerge at all was the prior affirmation, not only of the fact, but also of the worthwhileness of being yourself. If your shame has any purchase on reality, it rests on whatever gap there is between the deep value of your existence and the worth of what you've been allowed to make of it up to this point. The simple wisdom of Mr. Rogers' song shows its aptness here. I hope that you'll remember, even when you're feeling blue, that it's you I like. It's you yourself. It's you. Why do I like you? Because being you, even this you, is worthwhile. Still, self-affirmation, in its conviction that being you is worthwhile, includes a tacit acceptance that, at least from now on, being you is your responsibility. No one can be you for you. Will you be whoever you just happen to become? Will you be whoever the drifters expect you to be? Will you be you by accident, or will you be you on purpose? The prospect of taking responsibility for being ourselves returns us, whether we passed through a crucible of shame and defensiveness or not, to our disorientation. Immediately after Lonergan diagnosed the case of the drifter, having contrasted them with someone who exercises, quote, open-eyed, deliberate self-control, close quote, he wrote the following, from which the title of my lecture is drawn. But I must not misrepresent. We do not know ourselves very well. We cannot chart the future. We cannot control our environment completely or the influences that work on us. Our course is in the night. Our control is only rough and approximate. We have to believe and trust, to risk and dare. Lonergan's caveat might, of course, only raise more difficult questions. What should I believe? Who should I trust? What dare I risk? And if someone like me offered answers to any of these, how would you know if those answers are correct or not? After all, isn't any particular answer just one more questionable instance of believing, trusting, risking, daring, for which you are, now you recognize, inescapably responsible? Are you, to borrow the language of Lonergan's method in theology, just a gambler, and if a gambler, perhaps a fool to try to be yourself? Either way, how do you know? My students raise this question often, how do you know? They commonly raise it in response to challenging questions about knowledge, morality, and God. When they ask, how do you know, it's clear in context that they mean it in a skeptical way. It expresses their suspicion that nobody knows. It's a question that also serves, whether they mean it to or not, to end a conversation, which I think has a kind of protective function. These things can be uncomfortable to talk about in mixed company, and so how do you know can function like a gas station kill switch, shutting off the flow of noxious philosophical and theological discussion. And probably also they are in fact skeptical that anyone really knows. But I am a cruel and persistent teacher, so I pretend not to notice these subtexts and strategies. Instead, having my question answered with a question, I turn it back onto the class. Excellent question, I exclaim. How do you know? If you wanted to know the answer to these questions, how would you go about finding out? What would you do? My little secret, however, is that I know they have already done the most essential thing, and they have done it spontaneously. They have asked a question. And we did it too, just now, in response to Lonergan's caveat about trusting and believing and risking and daring. Like a reflex, out they popped. Because questions are, in Lonergan's idiom, spontaneous and dynamic. They emerge, and they emerge all on their own. You just have to notice. Now, it wouldn't be a Lonergan lecture without a mathematical metaphor. So, if getting oriented is like a geometric ray, don't worry, that's as far deep into the math as we're getting, then self-affirmation is like plotting the starting point, A. It marks off the place from which we begin, ourselves as we are, where we are. Our questions, then, are what give our line, AB, direction. And while there are some, even many, values you may not be able to realize in your life, and there are some, even many, things you may not get to know, there is nothing about which you cannot at least ask. So the line directed by our questions is, like the geometric ray, in principle infinite in extension. It is, again in principle, unrestricted. I should clarify, however, what I mean by questions. By questions, I do not merely mean any grammatically interrogative sentence. For there are rhetorical questions, there are bad faith questions, there are pedagogical, sometimes called Socratic questions. But by questions here, I mean expressions of a desire to know. So, for example, when Lonergan tells us we must believe and trust, risk and dare, those spontaneous and dynamic questions emerge because we want to know what to believe and to trust, to risk and to dare. We express our desire that the answers to our questions be true, and we want to know them so we can do something worthwhile with our unique, precious, and irreplaceable selves. Part of getting oriented in a disorienting world, then, is noticing. Because you are intelligent, questions will occur to you. But in order to ask your questions, which is to say really to follow the trajectory along which they orient you, you must first notice that they have emerged. Sometimes these questions will leap forth fully formed. This is often a matter of context. In this case, we are in an academic lecture, and so we have more or less dropped into what Lonergan called an intellectual pattern of experience. Our attention is keyed to ideas as the most relevant thing, and all the language is organized around that criterion of relevance. All the pieces of the questions are laying around and their significance is clear. As a result, they can rise to the surface more or less fully formed. I hope you'll make note of one or two to ask me at the end. But we do not, most of us, live our lives in this rarefied air. Our desire is for the truth and for what is worthwhile. Our desire for the truth and for what is worthwhile may have noisy, even chaotic competition in our experiencing. That competition may be coming from our surroundings, or it may be coming from inside the house, as they say. I don't know about you, but the inside of my head can be a bad neighborhood sometimes. Not only that, but sometimes the desire to know shows up without the language or images or ideas I need to formulate it as a question. Sometimes it just shows up as a feeling. It can be a relatively clear feeling like puzzlement or confusion or wonder, and sometimes its object can be obvious, if difficult to name. But other times the desire to know can be no more than an opaque, diffuse tension, a kind of cloud that descends. In that case, noticing can be more difficult. Getting oriented, then, calls for a special kind of interior watchfulness, a mindfulness, if you like. There are techniques for developing this kind of interior attention. Meditation can be one, prayer another, and even psychotherapy another. If you are a student or a scholar, as Simone Weil pointed out, your studies can serve as a long apprenticeship in this habit of interior attention. Learning, genuine learning, is a succession of transitions from wanting to understand to in fact understanding. So your studies provide serial opportunities to notice what you want to, but do not yet understand. This is why Weil says that those subjects in which you struggle are the most valuable, because they are the areas where you are forced to sit longest with your desire to understand, where the desire is not so quickly sated by your intellectual aptitude. However, I'm knocking this glass of water over. Even if you notice the presence of this desire in your experiencing, you may still struggle to express it in an apt question. Take heart, though, because the desire you experience, even though it is predicated on your lack of knowledge, is not completely empty. The desire carries guidance within it. In the language of phenomenology, your feeling of desire intends, that is, it makes you conscious of, not only the criteria of its satisfaction, but also the criteria of its own apt expression. If that's too technical a way of putting it, let me offer an analogy. Bring to mind that familiar experience of forgetting a word or perhaps someone's name. Now, imagine that you're speaking with someone else and they begin to offer you candidates for this word or name, rattling them off to assist your recall. You wave away the wrong answers. You know they're wrong right away. But if they hit on the right one, you recognize it. Why? How? Because folded into your feeling of desire for that missing word or name was a norm. And that norm has at last been met, been satisfied. It carried within it the standard of correctness. Finding the right words to ask your questions may not resolve so quickly as finding a single missing word or name. It may require an iterative process in which you alight on a way of asking that is close but not quite right. That initial question might not ask after what it is you really want to know. You might recognize that inadequacy immediately by comparison with the feeling of desire you have. You might only realize that insufficiency because the answer it calls forth are not really what you wanted to know. They're not the answers you're looking for. And so you may have to try again to reformulate your question so it better expresses your desire, better gets after what you want. But notice how you have kicked off a self-correcting process. And notice as well how the criterion, the standard of correctness, is already embedded in the desiring itself. And notice, finally, how this evinces that you are now oriented. You are pointed, albeit imperfectly, in the right direction, and all without even knowing the right answers yet. Your questions do not just contain the standard of their apt expression. As I said before, they also contain the standard for the correctness of their corresponding answers. This standard is essential to the problem of how do you know. It has two elements, however. The formulation of your questions only had to do justice to your desire to understand. The answers to your questions, however, must do justice both to the desire to understand and the experience, the data, the thing or situation or event you're trying to understand. And so correct answers to your questions must both A, make sense as an answer to that question, but also B, have support in the data about which you are asking. This latter condition, then, is what makes the difference between an answer that is satisfying in its cleverness and an answer that is satisfying because it is correct. But how will I know the difference between the answers that are correct and the answers that are merely clever? Good question. A philosophically satisfactory answer to that question would be a different lecture. But I can offer the beginning of an answer, a response, in other words, that will orient you in the direction of the more fulsome one. And once again, the answer is attentiveness to your desire to know. The tension experienced at the root of your questions will persist if answers are inadequate. Now, once again, it may happen that you fail to notice this persistent tension. Perhaps you will become distracted by the delight you have in the cleverness of some initial hypothesis. Or perhaps some other intervening factor on the screen of your smartphone, perhaps, will jump in and derail the self-correcting process of learning. Either way, you may end up accepting some clever falsehood rather than enduring the continuing passion of wonder. But the marvelous thing about our desire for truth and for goodness is that it will always be there waiting for us when we return to it. As any practitioner of meditation can tell you, no distraction is so profound that you cannot gently return your attention to the essential orienting thing. As you develop some facility with attentiveness to your questions, a new kind of disorientation may emerge. Because you are intelligent, you will experience lots of questions. Ironically, the more intelligent you are, the more questions you will have. And because the desire to know the truth and do what's worthwhile is unrestricted, those questions can be about anything and everything. In fact, that's something a university education relies upon. All those co-curriculars, all those core courses, all those gen ed requirements, they provide opportunity after opportunity for students to notice that they want to know about things that previously they might not have had any inkling they were interested in. This is what happened to me as a philosophy major. I was inducted into a whole new universe of questions that I didn't even know existed, and I discovered that I desperately wanted answers to them. But this cascade of new questions can be overwhelming. A new second-order set of questions emerges alongside them. Where to start? What to prioritize? How to integrate them all? After all, as I said before, time, energy, and experience are finite, but our questions are unrestricted. You won't be able to track down every answer, pursue every worthwhile activity. And this is where the two parts of this lecture up to this point converge. At the conjunction of self-affirmation and attentiveness to our questions, there emerges a process of what Lonergan called self-appropriation, what above he called open-eyed, deliberate self-control. Our own Father Colin Kay once asked me if Lonergan thought we needed to want to know everything about everything. And because our desire to understand is, in principle, unrestricted, this is a reasonable question. But to say that the desire to understand expressed by our questions is, in principle, unrestricted, means that the unrestrictedness is only what Aristotle would call a potency. It means you can ask about anything at all. It doesn't mean that you, in fact, will. To answer Father Colin's question, recall where self-affirmation began, with the recognition that only you get this unique and irreplaceable privilege of being you. By extension, then, only you are experiencing your experiences. And only you can have experiences in this life because, not only you, and you can have experiences in this life because you are also a body. Human bodies, you may have noticed, are located in space and time. Consequently, you only experience those data that are given in your experiencing when and where you are, for as long as you are. And so your actual questions, however much they may feel at times like a fire hose of wonder, are therefore finite. They have their occasions, and those occasions are limited by time and space. Moreover, because only you are you, that finite aggregate of questions is therefore uniquely and irreplaceably yours. They are the questions that it has been given for you to ask. You don't have to ask every question. You can't. You only need to ask your questions. Now, That might relieve you of some of the existential anxiety, but it doesn't help you with the overwhelming flood of questions you do actually confront. For that, you will need to move beyond the basic kind of orientation achieved by noticing that you desire the truth and the truly worthwhile. It means moving from wonder to wisdom. Now, in the most fulsome sense, wisdom involves well-ordered knowledge, both of what you have experienced, understood, and done so far, but also where all of those things are headed in the future. Wisdom, St. Thomas Aquinas says, means knowing how things are rightly ordered to their end, their goal. I have a slide about this. But there is also a basic kind of wisdom that comes not prior to experiencing, understanding, or deciding exactly, but emerges as the source and drive of those things. That's very abstract, so let me give you an example. Speaking of St. Thomas, he began his career, as every good medieval theologian did, by writing commentaries on Peter Lombard's Book of Sentences, which is this big, topically organized collection of Christian doctrines. Later, he would move on to writing Questiones Disputate, or disputed questions, which involved weighing and responding to difficult problems that arose at the conjunction of apparently contradictory teachings that you encountered in Lombard's sentences. But towards the end of his career, he worked on the Summa Theologica, in which the questions are not just aggregated together by topic, but the questions and topics are arranged in a certain order. Those questions were arranged pedagogically, but also in Latin sapientially, which is to say according to wisdom. They were arranged so that the student would start from the most basic things they needed to learn, accumulating the knowledge they needed to learn in order to understand more complicated ideas. And so wisdom involved, again, a certain kind of ordering towards an end, a goal, in Greek, a telos. But now the goal is adequate and systematic understanding. By analogy, then, the task of moving from the orientation of wonder to the orientation of wisdom involves arranging, organizing, prioritizing, and directing your questions. At one level, this will mean seeking out certain kinds of experiences, because experiences are what occasion your questions. That might mean seeking out experiences in the form of travel, or taking on new projects, or getting to know new people. But one way we can loose ourselves just a little from the place and time circumscriptions of this mortal flesh is to read. And watch movies and listen to music and look at art, sure, but reading, dare I say, is special. Because reading is the other side of writing. And writing, as I endlessly tell my students, is first and foremost interpersonal communication. And so if you want to experience a wider variety of yous than happen to be available in your time and at your place, it's hard to beat reading. If you can learn how to read in other languages, something I've never quite managed to do very well, I confess, you're in a whole other universe. In any case, the main point is this. If you want to begin to curate your questions, taking some agency over what you experience is a good place to start. And I will leave it to you to evaluate how the personalized, quote-unquote, algorithm-driven experiences provided by the apps on your phone fare by that analysis. But at a deeper level, developing the orientation of wisdom requires thinking about the end, goal, or telos of being you. It means giving attention to, asking after, thinking about, and ultimately deciding who you want to be and who you, concretely speaking, can be. What does that mean? Lonergan makes a distinction between the self as transcending, that is the you that is going beyond, and the self as transcended, the you that you've gotten beyond. Now, at one level, this distinction is abstract, because you never stop being identical with yourself. You don't become two people in some way. And that can be a real relief, no matter who you decide to be. You'll always succeed at having been you. But still, I think the distinction is helpful. The self-transcended, as I already discussed, isn't a blank slate. It's been formed into someone on the way to self-affirmation and self-appropriation. It has talents and limits. It has complications and blind spots. It has fears and desires, hopes and dreams, opportunities and resources. The self as transcending cannot ignore the concrete reality of the self as transcended. You have to start from somewhere, and there's nowhere to start but where you are. But the self as transcending can be that person, only more so. The The self as transcending can wonder what that self as transcended can become. The self as transcending can notice what the self as transcended desires to know and to do. It can try to find the apt language and images and symbols to express that desire. It can seek out the experiences that might raise the questions that lead to such knowledge, to those actions. The self as transcending can seek wise counsel, can select admirable models, can procure caring mentors and reliable partners and promising disciples. The self as transcending can show up a little more consistently. It can improve a little each time. It can notice when it needs a rest. It can accept the fact of failure. It can get up and try again. The self as transcending can believe and trust, risk and dare, ordering itself to its greater self as an end, a goal, a telos. The self as transcending with the orientation of wisdom can produce the first and only edition of him or herself. So for the sake of focus, this lecture has been somewhat restricted to the philosophical and maybe disappointingly to some, pretty light on theology. But I'll conclude with a final word about sanctification, about becoming a saint. At one level, my Lonerganian advice about how to get oriented, especially as regards the orientation of wonder, will serve you no matter your faith or lack thereof. You should know, however, that this advice amounts to, in effect, an exhortation to act as if God exists. Now, it is my professional and not just my personal opinion that God certainly exists. Indeed, if the word God means anything at all for a monotheist, it refers to that which exists necessarily. Still, it is only of a secondary importance that you believe me on that point. Speaking person to person, it is significantly more important, if you want to get oriented in our disorienting world, that you act as if God exists than that you believe God exists. Lonergan was fond of quoting St. Thomas Aquinas to the effect that true and false are in the mind, but the good is concrete. Judgments like God exists are abstract. They are about the correctness of an understanding, and understandings are always answers to particular questions that take a particular angle on experience. Consequently, a judgment like God exists will depend on how you understand God and the questions to which that understanding is a more or less adequate answer, to say nothing of the experiences that raised the question in the first place. Indeed, Vatican II's Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, makes a cognate acknowledgement that some portion of modern atheism has its roots in sincere misunderstandings and bad, even traumatic experiences. It goes so far as to acknowledge that in no small number of cases, Christians themselves have been the occasion for both. Still, to orient your living around your desire for truth and for value, and the questions it generates, is to live as though reality is ultimately intelligible and good. It is to set out the true and the good as your priority and goal. It is to treat them as ultimate in your living. But if the truth is ultimately true, then it is the object of some ultimate judgment. And if the worthwhile is ultimately good, then it is the object of some ultimate love. And if those conditions obtain, then there exists some ultimate knower of truth, some ultimate lover of reality. God, in other words. By extension, then, living as if those conditions obtain is to live as if God exists. Now, existentialist authors like Camus have exhorted us that even if we are certain that the universe is absurd, meaningless, and valueless, nevertheless, we may rebel against its absurdity by living as if our lives were meaningful and worthwhile. And so it seems possible to live as if God exists and yet believe God does not. And as I look around at many smart, responsible atheists I know, this is a relatively common existential posture. Still, it makes me think of an old joke, one I heard first from the eccentric Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who I think has visited Seton Hall a couple times. The man himself. A graduate student is leaving the physicist Niels Bohr's office and notices an upside-down horseshoe hung above the door, a totem for good luck. The student is scandalized. "Professor Bohr, you can't possibly believe in that superstitious nonsense." "Of course not," Bohr chuckles casually, "but they tell me it works even if you don't believe in it." Now, irony isn't going to dislodge existentialism. Existentialists tend to have a high tolerance for it. But there's a deeper issue. Because you experience yourself living as if God exists, that experience can occasion what Lonergan called the question of God. Lonergan breaks the question of God into three versions. Basically, is intelligibility intelligible? Is truth true? And is value worthwhile? As I explained above, if the answer to these questions is yes, then God exists. If the answer is no, then God may not exist. Should you continue to live as if God does exist, then you must live with that irony. Of course, you may elect not to pursue that question after it occurs to you at all. You can dodge it. To rationalize this dodge, you might appeal to your finitude, or to the orientation of wisdom even. In other words, that it isn't a priority based on the you are trying to be. You cannot, however, credibly pretend that decision is in accord with the orientation of wonder that lies underneath it. Either you're putting your questions in the driver's seat, or you aren't. The question of God isn't only relevant to the orientation of wonder, though. It also has significance for self-affirmation as well. By way of explanation, let me appeal to a pop culture example. My wife and I like to watch Netflix show Queer Eye, in which the Fab Five hosts, pictured here, give a lifestyle makeover to someone who has neglected cultivating themselves, more often than not, while being of extraordinary service to the other people in their lives. And the lifestyle makeovers come with a message, repeated again and again. You are worth taking care of too. You are worth loving too. It is a message, in other words, inviting self-affirmation. But why is this message credible? Why should guests believe the five hosts when they offer it, besides, of course, on the basis of their personal fabulousness? The fundamental answer, though, I'm convinced, is theological. If self-affirmation is the foundational judgment and evaluation at the core of the orientation of wonder, remember my ray, right? A is self-affirmation. Then the ultimate truth of that judgment and the value of that evaluation rests on God's infinite wisdom and love. God has decided, in God's infinite wisdom and love, that it is good you should exist. How do I know that? Because, as St. Thomas tells us, God creates according to God's intellect and will. And so, if you exist, then that's all the evidence of God's judgment on the matter you need. If you exist, God has made you, and made you the way God makes things, knowingly and lovingly. Self-affirmation, from another angle then, is an alignment of your own estimation of yourself with the divine mind and heart. This brings us now then to my brief word about sanctity, about being a saint. Mr. Rogers' spouse, Joan, said in many interviews that she didn't want people to think her husband was a quote-unquote saint. Now, in context, it was clear she meant she didn't want people to operate on the misapprehension that Fred was morally perfect. Indeed, in interviews with his children, one gets the sense that for as pastorally present as he was to his television neighbors, Mr. Rogers was maybe not everything his kids might have hoped for as a dad. But I am not at all convinced that saints are identified by their moral impeccability. In fact, the writings of the saints themselves should disabuse us of that impulse. St. Paul and St. Francis of Assisi both placed themselves at the bottom of the heap when it came to moral rectitude, claims which we might find incredible, but out of reverence for their sanctity, we should at least pause to consider. I would offer, as an admittedly underdeveloped thought, that sanctity, sainthood, being a saint, is first and foremost a matter of being yourself. Or more precisely, of being the you that God infinitely and eternally intends you to be. And because God is the source of truth's trueness and of the good's goodness, being yourself in this God-intended way is being truly yourself and being yourself well. Furthermore, because the good is concrete, the ultimate criterion, the ultimate standard of whether you are well and truly being yourself, and this is a little bit of a mind-bender, is you. There is no generic standard of sanctity, of sainthood. But what about Jesus, you might ask? What about the imitation of Christ? And at one level, yes, it's true that the Christian ought to look to Jesus as the exemplar of a human life lived with God as its ultimate end, goal, or telos. On the other hand, when the What Would Jesus Do bracelets were trendy, My dad used to warn me that there was a more apt question. What would Jesus have me do? Jesus' perfect holiness consisted in his obedience to the Father, and so by extension, your holiness or mine ought to consist in the same. I take this to be one of the upshots, for example, of St. Paul's body imagery in 1 Corinthians 12. God made you in part so that you would have the dignity of being the free and responsible source of real, concrete, particular goods in the unfolding of God's cosmic plan. And so in that regard, the entire universe is depending on you to do your part, to say nothing of your fellow human travelers. Of course, the familiar question arises again. How do you know? How do you know who it is God intends you to be? How do you know who the concrete how do you know the concrete particular good that is your responsibility to realize in this life? How do you know if you are well and truly being yourself? Although these questions for discernment, a theologian might call them, are big and high stakes, Lonergan's initial philosophical answer is the same. Notice and follow your questions. Hone them until they are sharp enough to get the answers you want. Be dogged in your efforts to verify that those answers are correct. Notice, too, how each adequate answer is itself the source of the next batch of questions. Seek the orientation of wisdom that can help you sift and organize and prioritize those as they pile up. But if a merely philosophical appeal to the orientations of of wonder and of wisdom still leave you feeling too overwhelmed, Lonergan has a theological corollary that might provide some solace. For Lonergan, following St. Thomas and others, the desire for truth and value that turns out to be in the limit a desire for God, that same desire is also a desire from God. Lonergan quotes St. Thomas describing it as a created participation in uncreated light. This language of participation names a kind of receptivity or dependence. In my desire for truth and value, God is giving me the source of my orientation. God is, in other words, always there to help you get oriented in our disorienting world. You only have to learn how to notice and accept God's help. Not only that, but as you cultivate this habit of interior attention, you can discover that God has always already been with you. God has been with you in, through, and as your questions. In the midst of your disorientation, calling you out of the wilderness, ready to calm the storm. All God asks in return is that you believe and trust, risk and dare. Thank you. I'm going to try not to wander from my microphone for the sake of the same here. Yeah, red button on the bottom. And there should be a, yep, I see.
No, I didn't mean that, you know. There are about 8 billion people in the world. Based upon your subjective estimation, how many of them maintain authentic self, or if you borrow your expression, being yourself, and how many of them are drifters? Again, based upon your subjective estimation, do you think the building of ethics of maximum harmony feasible? Such ethics needs to not to kill each other and to prevent the demise of the good earth.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In Lonergan's dissertation, there's a section that begins, St. Thomas Aquinas had a pessimistic view of human nature. He would quote frequently, in the Latin, from the Latin Vulgate, the number of stupid people is infinite. And then Lonergan says, and Thomas had an imposing metaphysical argument for this conclusion. Lonergan takes Thomas to be appealing to the problem of what Lonergan calls moral impotence. And Lonergan has also an opposing metaphysical argument for what makes that kind of intellectual, moral, and existential impotence probable. And so I don't have a ratio for you, except to say probably a lot of people are suffering from various degrees of inauthenticity. In the Christian theological tradition, we talk about it as original sin. Now, Lonergan, in the 1930s, for reasons you can probably divine, suddenly became interested in the analysis of historical process. I don't know what was going on in the 30s that made him think about that, but you can figure it out probably. And one of the things he came to on a analogy from Newton's model for the perturbed ellipses of the planets was that historical process can't be, as the liberal sometimes thought it was, a matter only of progress. That to try to analyze not just historical process, but also the particular person's trajectory in life, trying to rely only on progress as your notion is like trying to analyze the orbits of the planets in terms only of inertia. It ain't going to work. And he added to this notion of decline, which is a kind of philosophical correlate of sin. But that, too, actually, he thought was inadequate. And he thought that there were plenty of philosophical minds that had hit on this, and various kinds of philosophical pessimism and sort of thing. But Lonergan thinks you need three notions to model not just historical process of humanity, but of also the particular individual. And the third term is redemption, is cooperation with divine grace, for which we are both given the grace, the operative grace that gives us the occasion to cooperate, and then the actual graces that carry us through our cooperation. And so I don't at all think it is contradictory to say that inauthenticity is a widespread existential problem in the human race, and also that in Christ, God will save us from our inauthenticity. I don't know exactly what that salvation will look like. The Christian apocalypse of John is confusing, and many have tried to decode it. I grew up in a tradition that had a lot of fun doing that, wrote very popular books, made a few movies with Kirk Cameron. I don't much go in for that, but anyway, yeah. Thank you.
You threw math at us, so it's only fair you got a mathematical question right off the bat.
Ratios I can do, I think.
Other questions?
I also always have questions. So, first of all, I did not grow up watching Mr. Rogers because I grew up in different countries, in England and Australia. But I did grow up with British parents for whom being selfish was a really bad thing, right?
Yeah.
It was up there with not making your bed and not washing behind your ears and a host of other really bad things. And it was always sort of the mantra that you should think of others before yourself. And I don't know, I'm sure other people are familiar with this kind of upbringing. And then here at Seton Hall, we put a lot of emphasis on service, servant leadership, but also the same kind of principle. And it strikes me that it's very easy to move from that to a very inauthentic, well, I don't matter, right? Mm-hmm. I only matter as far as I can help others. I have no importance in myself.
And then you're a guest on Queer Eye, yeah.
Right, and then I can see how easily that might happen. So, what's yours or Father Lonergan's thoughts on that slippery slope, so to speak?
No, it's good. Lonergan talks about the human person he talks about the human person as originating value. That part of the value of the human person is not just that they are an originated value, that God has made them, though I emphasize that. But one of the things that's special about the human person is that we are a source of value in the universe. And moral value, right? That we have the dignity of deciding that we are going to make there be more true and good stuff in the universe. And so, yes, well, I think, one could maybe hear this lecture and think that this is a kind of that self-affirmation is a kind of narcissistic enterprise. Certainly not how Lonergan means it. It's not how I mean it. But I could understand the impression. After 9/11, Mr. Rogers had gone off the air. Fred Rogers had retired. But he got together with PBS to do a kind of special episode after he was retired. And the episode is fascinating to watch because he's addressing at that point, a few decades worth of television neighbors who watched his show. And in the special episode, he's not addressing the kids, he's addressing their parents who very likely grew up watching his show, at least in the States. And he says, I'm so proud of you for who you've grown up to be and for how you are being there for your children in this scary time. And then he says something which has become a meme that you'll see sometimes on social media, which is that, I can't remember if it was his mother or his grandfather, I can't remember, but one of his primary caregivers told him that when things were scary or overwhelming or disorienting, to look for the helpers, right? That when things in television were showing you all the terrible things that can happen in the world, that in the frame you can often find the people who had shown up to be of assistance to others. And for me, in my own life and work, speaking person to person, being an academic is an invitation to all kinds of psychodrama about prestige and acknowledgement and accomplishment and position and et cetera. And that stuff, getting preoccupied with that stuff is a path to hell. I mean, that way leads to madness. And so for me, the way that I try to be me in this world that I'm in is I hold out as my A1 primary value, the thing that makes me feel good about doing what I do is what I'm doing helpful. And I don't find, as a kind of experimental matter, as an existential and practical matter, I don't find any contradiction between being committed to, all right, who is the me that I'm trying to be? The me I'm trying to be is the one that is helpful. And so there, service to others and a kind of existential focus on being me are in perfect accord. And in fact, I think that's what I settled on. Because I feel, like I said before, the inside of my head is like a better neighborhood when I can keep that as my measure. I hope that's an answer.
I'm just trying to formulate my question.
Okay, good. You can iterate.
This was a tour de force. It really was, and I guess I relate it to Seton Hall being a Catholic university, and maybe even your experience so far as to what degree. I guess this is probably not the right way to put it. To what degree are we succeeding in what you are setting out before us? In other words, are we getting there with the students, and even the very religious students, which we have a number, in terms of their own self-knowledge and self-appropriation, using big terms like that?
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah.
You're asking for my impressions of sort of how it's going here?
Yeah.
I'm pretty new. I've only been here a few years. So my data set is small relative to people in this room. Like I was saying about self-affirmation, is self-affirmation often, it feels like, at least in my sort of analysis of it, always, what's Lonergan's line? A little breathless and a little late. That self-affirmation is always kind of behind the ball. Heidegger talks about it as thrownness, right? You sort of come to existential consciousness, and you're already in this thing. And so when I encounter our students, who I like very much, and who I really like teaching, we show up a little breathless and a little late in their development, right? And they've received a lot of messages about what this institution is for. They've received, not just Seton Hall, but the higher education as a whole, where it fits in the world, where it fits in society, where it fits in their life. And they have people who are important in their lives who've been the sources of those messages, who care about them and who've pressed those messages out of care. And it produces a set of anxieties for them and a set of priorities for them that, I would revise if I could. Am I being too elusive, or do we know what I'm talking about? I think my students show up in core classes, and I say, "Why are you taking this class?" And they said, "Because they're making me." Right? And I always prod at that, and I'm like, "How? Like, are you in danger? Do I need to call somebody?" Well, no, it's a requirement. Well, who's requiring you? Well, the university. Well, why are you in a position the university can require things from you? Which is to say, why are you here? And the answer invariably is like, well, because I want to get a certain kind of job, with this not so subtle implication that, like, I want to be at a certain socioeconomic bracket. Totally normal stuff. I think here we have, remember when I talked about the drifter, that you can drift in more or less friendly seas, that there are cultural and social and institutional structures that are meant to sort of float you while you're drifting so that you don't drift in a bad direction. One of the reasons I'm happy to be here and that I like being here and I like teaching here and I like the opportunity to do things like this is that there is infrastructure here to provide occasions for students to have the experiences in which the questions that might lead them to a different set of priorities and a different way of thinking about themselves in relationship to this institution and to the rest of their lives and to the rest of the world, there's an infrastructure to create those experiences, and students, I don't know what portion of students avail themselves of those experiences. But I also think there's a certain amount of, like, because so for Lonergan has a thing called the integral scale of values. And in this integral scale of values, it's vital values, social values, which are like technology, economic structures, and political structures. And then cultural values, which is kind of what we're doing here, which is reflecting on the relative meaningfulness and worthwhileness of the technology, the economy, and the politics that we have built our lives with. But Lonergan does a weird thing, which is he puts above cultural value personal value, the value of a person. And that seems, on the face of it, wrong, because persons are aggregated into societies and within cultures. And so it seems like the personal should be under the cultural and social. But Lonergan didn't do this by accident, because for Lonergan, the social and the cultural are ordered to the flourishing of persons. And so the investments that the university has made in that infrastructure to provide those experiences that can raise those questions, that can change the horizon of students, you don't, like, at a cosmic level, even if you just get one. Right? I mean, even if you just get one, you've done something of, as Dignitatis Infinita said a couple years ago, the Vatican document, you've contributed to something that of itself is of infinite dignity and worth. So I mean, like, look, would I love to get more than one? Yeah, that'd be awesome. Would I like to get most of them? Absolutely. But I I just can't get on board with the idea that like if you're below 50%, you're wasting your time and effort. Because the differential of decline is still operating. The number of stupid people remains infinite. He said with his tongue in his cheek, looking into the camera. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, but also, I don't know. I'm new here. I could make it so.
You could? Okay. I can ask one.
Uh-oh.
I've been patient. So, John, I thought I found what you said very illuminating when you talked about how our questions can actually orient us. Mm-hmm. That dynamism, that drives us through life. And, my basic question is, very practically speaking, of what help do you think that is to people today, especially young people today, like our students, and to give a little more context behind that. I also think about what you said earlier in your lecture, that students will ask that question, well, how do you know, with a sort of, you sense a protectiveness there. It's a way of shutting down the conversation so they don't have to be vulnerable in that space. So given that there is that kind of defensiveness there, realistically speaking, how does that proposal that to develop your capacity for attentiveness in a profound way, to really embrace one's questions and to follow them where they lead, you propose that as something that's helpful, that can orient us in the dark, but that could also be scary. Very often we, and Lonergan talks about this as well, obviously. Very often we quash those questions because we're afraid of where they're going to lead us. So, how do you think about that?
Yeah, good. Well, and there can be another version of that too, right? I mean, I'm giving voice to the predominating version of it that's a kind of, let's be charitable, kind of ethos of tolerance. That, look, let's not go there, because then getting along with one another in this space is going to be more complicated. But there's another version too, which is a kind of more pious version, right? Which is that I was floating in some seas that were really highly developed, and I have some really determinate ideas about who I am and what this life is about and how the world's supposed to work. And darn it, these questions just keep coming up, so we better stuff those down real good, or it's going to blow up this whole thing that I got provided as a young person. And so you can avoid questions from that angle too. Maurice Blondel in his book L'Action has a line about, he's talking about modern philosophy, and he says what is needed is a still more pious impiety, which is to say that's going to sort of pass through skepticism and question skepticism itself. That's a kind of boldness and courageousness of spirit that can be hard. Blondel's a pretty bold and courageous guy. But practically speaking, when it comes to students, it's a matter of, my teacher, Robert Doran, who passed about 5 years ago now, he touched on a line Lonergan has about us being conscious in two ways. That we have a kind of our intellectual and moral consciousness, which is what I highlighted here. That the way you're going to get oriented is that you're gonna click into, you're gonna connect with. We're just gonna do that right now. I don't know. Did I do it right? No worries. You're conscious in two ways, and the first way is kind of what Lonergan calls intentional consciousness, which is the consciousness that asks questions about truth and asks questions about value. But the other way of being conscious is like the whole rest of your psychology, which is like all of your feelings. And Lonergan says that they give our living mass and momentum, right? So our ray has no extension except on one dimension. It's pointing. But the thing that's going to turn your ray into a vector is your feelings. And so not only is it a matter of, as I said here, the wisdom to be able to organize your questions, but also to be able to give a parallel attention to your feelings and your imagination and your psychological, the whole psychological dynamic of your living, and then to be able to give attention to it and then learn how to regulate it so it doesn't disintegrate those two ways of being conscious. And the reality is that if you want students to ask these kinds of questions that I was talking in response to Monsignor Liddy's question about, the kind of questions that get raised in the core department especially, they're going to have feelings about it. And they need to be able to regulate their feelings while they engage the ideas. And whatever else our students are, they're also mammals. And I heard a doctor say once, pain in mammals produces aggression, which explained why when my dad, who was vision impaired, would hit his head on the corner of an open cabinet because I'd left it open, he would slam that thing shut, right? Because pain in mammals produces aggression. So if students are encountering new ideas that are challenging, they're going to have feelings, and their feelings are going to be sometimes volatile. Now, the other thing about mammals is that mammals regulate their affects. I'm back to Alan Shore and his school of interpersonal neuropsychology. Mammals regulate their affects through body-to-body attunement. That there's we don't just think with our brains behind our eyes, but all of the neurology of our whole body is involved in our consciousness. And so the regulation of think about with little kids, what happens when they're dysregulated, when they're upset. What do parents do, or other caregivers? They scoop them up and they hold them to themselves, right? And they rock, and they may sing, and vocal prosody has connected to the sort of later laminations of the vagus nerve. You can read polyvagal theory on your own. Now, I'm not going to scoop up my students and hug them and rock them. Fear not. But we are in a physical space together in a classroom, and the comportment of my physicality, my ability to stay regulated when they become dysregulated by their engagement with new ideas that are changing the horizon of their living, which is to say changing themselves, right? The self that's transcended, that's a kind of a loss of a self. That's scary business. And so part of teaching for me is both pressing students to engage the questions and take them seriously and take the ideas from step to step to step, but also to acknowledge and to help not just model but attune to the feelings they're having as a mode of regulating that's part and parcel of teaching. And it's why I just I made this decision probably a year and a half ago. I've been toying with it before, but I made the decision. Other than maybe some graduate teaching or like certificate programs, for undergraduate teaching, I simply refuse to teach online courses. I won't do it. Because I don't, maybe upper level major, maybe, but I mean, the good is concrete, right? So you gotta have prudence and make decisions about concrete situations. But as a general rule, speaking for myself, I don't think I can ethically teach Teams or Zoom mediated online courses of the kind that I teach, because I can't do half my job. I can't be a body in the room attuning to the affectivity of my students as they try to have their world changed by ideas. So anyway, that's 9 answers to your question, but thank you. It's a great question, though. I think about it, as you can see, I think about it a lot.
Well, thank you for your ideas and your bodily attunement to everyone in this room. Would you all join me in thanking Dr. Heaps? Thank you, friends, for being with us this afternoon. I wish you the best as the end of the semester, finals, and the mountains of grading and all the rest approaches. But on the other side of that, there is joy and peace. Our annual faculty summer seminar, which Monsignor began almost 30 years ago, the tradition continues. It'll be May 26th, 27th, 28th. I'm really excited. We're having a top caliber theologian, William Cavanaugh from DePaul, will be here to help us to explore the modern idolatries of consumerism and nationalism through an Augustinian lens. I think will be really fascinating. And then a couple of weeks later, June 11th and 12th, we will be back down at San Alfonso Retreat Center on the shore for our annual faculty retreat. So multiple opportunities to come together, to recover from the year, to think deeply, to spend some time together. So I hope to see you all there. Let's thank John one more time for being with us. Thank you, everyone.